Back in the day, the muscle car scene was a wild time. Detroit was cranking out raw power and bold designs left and right. It was a golden age of American automotive ingenuity. But you know how it goes. Sometimes even the coolest cars get lost in the shuffle. Some got overshadowed by their bigger brothers. Some were just misunderstood. And some were just too far ahead of their time for folks to appreciate. But that's what we're here for, right? Today, we're firing up the Wayback Machine and taking a look at 10 forgotten muscle cars that were true pioneers. These are the cars that pushed boundaries, introduced groundbreaking features, and left their mark on automotive history. So buckle up, folks, because we're about to rediscover some true automotive legends. Now, when you think of a muscle car, you probably picture a big old V8 engine, right? Well, Pontiac decided to do things a little differently with the 1969 Firebird Sprint. See, this baby was aimed at the enthusiast driver who wanted something a little different, a little more nimble. So instead of a rumbling V8, Pontiac dropped in a high-revving 4.1-liter inline-six. Now, before you scoff, this wasn't your grandpa's six-cylinder. This thing had a factory 4-barrel carburetor and could really wind up, producing a respectable 215 horsepower. But the real magic of the Sprint was in the way it handled. Pontiac gave it a stiffer suspension, making it one of the best-handling muscle cars of its time. It was like a European sports car in an American muscle car suit. Now, let's talk about a car that was big on performance but small in stature, the 1968 AMC AMX. This two-seater was a real head-turner with a compact design that was way ahead of its time. At just 179 inches long, it was shorter than most of its competitors, which gave it an edge in agility. But don't let its size fool you. This little guy packed a punch. Under the hood was a 390 cubic inch V8 engine that churned out a mighty 315 horsepower. It was a real pocket rocket, capable of embarrassing much larger muscle cars on the track. And get this, the AMX was the first ever production car to offer a fiberglass body as an option. That's right, fiberglass. It was a lightweight speed demon that was ahead of its time. Sadly, it got lost in the muscle car wars, overshadowed by its bigger, louder competitors. Now folks, you know me, I love a good sleeper car. And the 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1 was the ultimate sleeper. Back then, Buick wasn't really known for building fire-breathing muscle cars. They were known for their comfortable cruisers, their land yachts. But the GSX Stage 1? Oh boy, this thing was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Under the hood lurked a monstrous 455 cubic inch V8 engine. This thing was a torque monster, cranking out a staggering 510 lb-ft of torque. That's more torque than a lot of diesel trucks today. It was the king of the stoplight Grand Prix, capable of rocketing from 0 to 60 in under 6 seconds. And it looked the part too, with its aggressive styling and those iconic racing stripes. They only offered it in yellow or white, to make sure people saw you coming. It was a performance bargain that could hang with the best of them. But sadly, it didn't get the recognition it deserved at the time. Now let's talk about a car that was built for pure, unadulterated power, the 1971 Plymouth GTX 440+6. This thing was a beast, with a name that sounded like it came straight out of a hot rodder's dream. Under the hood, you had a 440 cubic inch V8 with not one, not two, but 3 two-barrel carburetors. That's right folks, 3 deuces. This thing could churn out a tire-melting 390 horsepower. And it had the looks to match that power. The GTX 440+6 had this aggressive, in-your-face styling with a massive hood scoop called the air grabber that you could manually open and close. It was like letting the engine breathe before it unleashed all that fury on the asphalt. Sadly, the GTX 440+6 came out just as the muscle car era was winding down. It was a car that was born a little too late, but it's still a legend in the hearts of true muscle car enthusiasts. Now the Pontiac GTO, that's a name that echoes through muscle car history, right? But by 1973, the golden age of muscle was fading. Stricter emissions regulations and rising gas prices meant that big, thirsty V8s were on their way out. But Pontiac still managed to squeeze out one last hurrah with the 1973 GTO. Now, it wasn't as powerful as its predecessors, but it still had a respectable 400 cubic inch V8 under the hood, good for 230 horsepower. And they'd improved the suspension, so it handled better than ever. Sure, the styling was a little more subdued compared to the wilder GTOs of the past, but it was still a handsome car. The 1973 GTO was a reminder that even in a changing world, Pontiac wasn't afraid to inject a little excitement into their cars. It may have marked the end of an era, but it did so with style and grace. Now folks, when you think of classic Ford muscle cars, the Mustang is usually the first one that comes to mind. And don't get me wrong, the Mustang is a legend. But Ford had another weapon in its arsenal back then, a car that often gets overlooked, the 1970 Ford Torino Cobra. This thing was a beast in a suit, with understated styling that hid a fire-breathing monster under the hood. They dropped in a 429 cubic inch Super Cobra Jet V8. That's the same engine they used in their NASCAR races. It was a torque monster, capable of spinning the tires all the way through first, second, maybe even third gear. It was designed for one thing and one thing only, to go fast in a straight line. And it did that exceptionally well. But for some reason, it never quite captured the hearts of enthusiasts the way the Mustang did. It's a shame, because the Torino Cobra was a true performance bargain. Now let's talk about a car that brought muscle car thrills to the masses, the 1971 Dodge Charger Super Bee. See, not everyone back then could afford a top-of-the-line muscle car. But Dodge wanted to give everyone a chance to experience the thrill of a big V8 and a rumbling exhaust. So they came out with the Super Bee. It was a no-frills, all-thrills machine. Under the hood, you could get a 440 cubic inch V8 that pumped out an impressive 385 horsepower. And if you wanted even more power, they offered a 6-pack carburetor option. It was a car that was built for pure driving enjoyment. It might not have had all the bells and whistles of its more expensive siblings, but it delivered when it came to raw performance. It's a testament to Dodge's commitment to making muscle cars accessible to everyone. Now, here's a car that's a little more obscure, a little more rare. The 1970 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 2. This thing was built with racing in its DNA. They designed it specifically for NASCAR, with a long aerodynamic nose and a sloping roofline to cheat the wind. And under the hood, it packed a serious punch, a 429 cubic inch V8 engine that could really move. But the Cyclone Spoiler 2 wasn't just about straight-line speed. It had a sophisticated suspension system that gave it surprisingly good handling for a car of its size. It was a true driver's car, and it looked the part too, with its aggressive styling and those iconic racing stripes. Sadly, the Cyclone Spoiler 2 was a victim of changing times. NASCAR was moving away from these aero cars, and the muscle car era was coming to an end. Now, let's talk about a car that was truly unique, truly ahead of its time. The 1974 AMC Matador X. This car was a bold departure from the traditional muscle car formula. It had this futuristic, almost spaceship-like design that turned heads wherever it went. And under the hood, it packed a respectable 401 cubic inch V8 engine. Now, it wasn't the most powerful muscle car on the block, but it had more than enough grunt to get your heart racing. But the Matador X wasn't just about brute force. It was a well-rounded car with a comfortable interior and a surprisingly smooth ride. It was a muscle car for the thinking man, a car that combined performance with style and sophistication. Sadly, it was a little too different for the average muscle car buyer back then, and it never really caught on. Now, for our final forgotten muscle car, we're going back to the basics. The 1968 Chevrolet Nova SS L78. Now, the Nova was never really considered a top-tier muscle car. It was seen as more of an economy car. But Chevy decided to spice things up a bit with the L78 package. They took their potent 396 cubic inch V8 engine and dropped it into the little Nova. And let me tell you, it transformed the car. It was like a wolf in sheep's clothing. The Nova SS L78 was a sleeper in the truest sense of the word. It looked unassuming, but under the hood, it had the heart of a lion. It could outrun many of the bigger, more powerful muscle cars of its day. And it did it all while flying under the radar. It was the ultimate Q-ship, a car that was all about performance without the flashy looks. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the most unassuming cars can be the most fun to drive. Well folks, there you have it. 10 forgotten muscle cars that were way ahead of their time. These cars might not have gotten the recognition they deserved back in the day, but they left their mark on automotive history. They were pioneers, innovators, and most importantly, they were a heck of a lot of fun to drive. So the next time you're at a car show or browsing the classifieds, keep an eye out for these forgotten heroes. You might just discover your new dream car. You might